Good evening, everyone. Welcome to one of Balliol's online seminars. My name is John Paul Gabriel, and I'm the early modern history tutor here at Balliol, and welcoming you from Staircase 18 in college. And it's a great pleasure to have with us tonight all of you, and especially our speaker, James Belich. Professor Belich is the Beit Professor of Global and Imperial History here at the University of Oxford, and he's a Professorial Fellow at Balliol College. And we're very happy to have Jamie with us tonight to talk to us about some of the research he's been working on, most recently from his published book. Jamie has played a central role here at Oxford in the establishment of Oxford's Centre for Global History, and really in developing the place of global history within the university, but also here in the UK and within the world. Now, sometimes people ask me, what is global history? To which I would just say, well, this is global history. Jamie writes big books. And his earliest research really started with the history of New Zealand, but working on New Zealand in a global context. A two-volume history of New Zealand making peoples in 1996, and a second volume called Paradise Reforged, 2001. Anyone who's been to New Zealand knows just how well the global impact of that small place in the world has been, and he's brought that out really well in his work. And from there, he turned his attention to a comparative history of British and American settler societies. That's to say, the relationship between these two empires and the domains they settled in a long chronology stretching from the late 18th century to the 1930s. And I would warmly encourage this book to you, Replenishing the Earth, the Settler Revolution, and the Rise of the Anglo World, 1783 to 1939. Now, since then, Jamie has been working away for some time on the study of the plague. And this is what he'll take us to talk about a bit today. Now, I think on the one hand, he couldn't have expected when he started this work that he'd be writing about the plague in the midst of a plague. But also, I think what he might not have expected, and we are all very proud of him for this, is that this book, The World the Plague Made, The Black Death and the Rise of the Empire of Europe, that this book would be shortlisted for the Wolfson Prize, which I dare say is one of the most prestigious prizes awarded each year to historians writing here in the UK. So we're very happy to have Jamie with us tonight to give us a taste of this research and to speak to us. The title of the paper is Why Europe, Why Pestis? The Black Death and the Rise of West Eurasia. Over to you, Jamie.
Thank you very much indeed, John Paul. The check is in the mail. It was a very kind introduction. My failure to win the top prize at the Wolfson, of course, was an anti-New Zealand conspiracy, but I've learned to expect that. This lecture is a new answer to an old question. The old question being, why Europe? The new answer being, why pestis? And since I've only got 35 minutes or so to revolutionize your understanding of early modern history, I'll get into it as quickly as I can. Recent research on the Black Death requires 3 revisions to our understanding of it. First, it seems it did not hit China or India, as has long been assumed, but instead was largely restricted to West Eurasia, by which I mean Catholic Western Europe, Orthodox Eastern Europe, and a Muslim South, comprising the Middle East, North Africa, and the varying chunks of Southern Europe and Eastern Europe that were under Muslim control at various times. The second revision is that mortality in the Black Death itself was even higher, and of course the dates are circa 1345 to 53 for the first strike. That mortality in this first strike was even higher than the standard estimates, which, as you may know, 25% to 33%, let's say 30%. Astonishingly, the evidence actually is that an average of 50% mortality is more likely. Now, medieval mortality statistics, as we all know, are infinitely contestable, but put it this way, the evidence for 50% is better than the evidence for 30%. Some regions did escape the first strike, but were caught up by later strikes, and there were no less than 16 later strikes by 1520, after the 1350 first strike. None was as widespread or as lethal as the first, but they often came close to one or the other. And they tended to mean that mortality was maintained. For 150 years, Europe's population was about half its norm before or after that period. Team studies suggest that in England, which is particularly well studied in this respect, the population dropped by 60% between 1348 and 1450, followed by stasis until around 1520 and full recovery only by 1625. For Catalonia, Tuscany, Norway, and Egypt, the percentages are similar. So the Black Death was not a single event around 1350, but an entire plague era linking the late medieval with the early modern, 1350, 1500. The third revision is that it's not really a revision, but rather the restoration of an older view, is that the much criticised notion that the Black Death and subsequent strikes were rat-borne bubonic plague has been confirmed by recent science, which has found traces of the pathogen, Yersinia pestis or Y. pestis, in hundreds of human skeletons in mass plague graves all over Europe and in a few parts of its neighbours as well. This is more than a technicality. Y. pestis, bubonic plague, is even more lethal to black rats than to humans. So for a second plague strike to occur, let alone 17 of them, a region had first to be resettled by uninfected rats. Unassisted rat spread is about 20 kilometres a year. Pneumonic plague, spread by human spittle, which is another variant, had a range of about 2 metres. Sufferers could not travel and died within a day or two. It may have boosted mortality in crowd contexts, but it could not transfer plague far. Long-range spread, therefore, was by rats hitchhiking in grain cargoes, large enough to hide them. So widespread plague required widespread trade. As we have recently relearned the hard way with COVID, pandemics are a joint venture between local outbreaks and human connectivity. Post-plague prosperity firmly contradicts the still common pessimist view that 150 years after 1350 was a late medieval depression, a very common phrase in the literature. But it accords with the increasing number of optimists amongst economic historians who see a post-plague economic upturn per capita. But even the optimists seldom finger the plague paradox behind this, which is an increase in aggregate demand for some luxuries and some semi-luxuries as early as the 1360s. Half as many people, that is, consumed more than twice as much. Unlike most catastrophes, plague destroyed people, rats, and very little else. The average endowment of everything suddenly doubled. Money, tools, buildings, ships, fertile lands, college fellowships, you name it. Europe was not in an overpopulated Malthusian state in 1345, I think, but it was definitely undercapitalized and most people were very poor. Experts think that the buying classes, those who made regular use of the market, amounted to only 5%, a tiny minority. Plague suddenly transformed the situation for the survivors. The evidence of growth in real incomes in both wage work and farming is patchy, but cumulatively overwhelming. The notion of a golden age for common folk may be pushing it, but the disposable real incomes of many people increase substantially. If your income is £10 a year, of which £9 goes on the basics, then an increase of 30% in your income, which is a very conservative estimate of what did actually happen, quadruples your disposable income. Population halved, but both the buying classes and their spending power multiplied. The things in newly high demand included exotic luxuries like spices, fine cottons and silks, which were markers of status, of course, and extractive goods like furs, whale products, and cured fish, as well as bullion and slaves. All these were prone to quick depletion if there was a new spasm of demand. Early forays outside West Eurasia were aimed at obtaining these very goods. Novgorod sought more sable pelts across the Urals from the 1360s, making a serious attempt at the conquest of northwest Siberia in the 1440s. Muscovy took up the project with greater success from 1465 and established a permanent lodgement in Siberian Asia by 1499. Portuguese raided for slaves in the Canary Islands, also from the 1360s. The first island was conquered in 1402. The Portuguese sought both slaves and gold in West Africa thereafter, where the first durable lodgement came in 1445. They had to take increasingly wide loops westward into the South Atlantic to catch the prevailing winds home. From the 1390s, Northern European fishers sought cod and whales further and further into the North Atlantic. By the mid-15th century, with or without Columbus, Europeans were on their way to the Americas in three directions. There was also a more gentle upturn in a long-standing Muslim interaction with the Indian Ocean world, especially the spice-producing regions, yet again beginning in the 1360s. Stemming from southern Arabian ports, this trade push is traceable through new tombs, new shrines, new epigraphs, and the sudden disappearance of pork bones in middens. This trade push joined hands with an unusual Chinese long-range outreach, best known from Admiral Zheng He's 7 voyages of 1405 to 1453, although there were overland equivalents as well, much less known. This Ming Muslim joint venture reconfigured the Indian Ocean trading world and doubled its spice production before Vasco da Gama. Europe received a share of the increase, but only after Muslim middlemen and Ming China had taken their cuts. There was only one thing that Portugal, Novgorod, and southern Arabia had in common: the Black Death. Now, motives for expansion are one thing. Having the means to expand successfully is quite another. Back home in West Eurasia, an expansion kit emerged, taking shape gradually under plague's brutal influence. Technology was one key element. More capital now chased less labour, triggering a sharp upturn in 3 inanimate sources of energy: wind power, water power, and chemical energy in the form of gunpowder. All were in use before plague and the Black Death in 1350, circa 1350, but were plague supercharged after it. Water power came into use for many purposes beyond grinding grain, notably in metallurgy, powering blast furnaces and refining hammers. European iron output surged in absolute terms, let alone per capita. Iron from leading exporter Sweden sold through Hanseatic Lübeck, and sales increased 132% between 1366 and 1492. Copper imports increased almost 300% in the same period. Long series of iron nail prices from several countries show, I quote, that the Black Death appears to have triggered the long-term downward pressure on iron prices. Peasants now had pans as well as pots, scythes as well as sickles. Soldiers had better armour and better weapons. More iron meant more steel, and relatively light, quick-quenched steel plate armour, steel crossbows, and all steel swords all emerged soon after the plague. Previously, swords had steel edges on an iron base because steel was so rare and expensive. Now there was more bronze and more iron for guns, which of course had come via the Mongols from China shortly before the plague. Big siege cannon predated 1350, but small cannon usable on walls or in field battles appeared in the 1380s. Still smaller guns, usable by one person, emerged by 1410. They were initially less effective than bows, but they saved labour time by saving training time. It took 10 years to produce a good longbowman or a good mounted archer, 10 weeks to produce a competent musketeer. Recent histories play down the importance of the arquebus and the musket to European conquests. And it's true they were slow to load, prone to misfire, and accurate only to 80 or 100 yards or so. But by the 1500s, they delivered a dozen times the kinetic energy of arrows and were able to penetrate even steel armor. People who encountered them were eager to acquire or emulate them. Asians, Africans, and Amerindians. These peoples were not fools. Windmills improved and proliferated, quite an interesting story, but one on which I cannot dwell. But the big user of wind power was shipping. Before 1350, West Eurasia, like further Asia, used a mix of sail-only ships and oared ships. Sail-only ships, typically with just one mast, were not very maneuverable. They sailed only in seasons and on routes where weather and sea conditions were predictably benign. So their sailing season was typically rather short. Galleys were used for trickier waters and trickier seasons, but had a low cargo capacity and had to stay close to coasts to take on water for their numerous crews. So they too used sail when possible, and these expensive crews of up to 200 or even more were essentially insurance against adverse tides and tricky currents and physical attack by pirates and the like. The Black Death bequeathed an immediate plague bonus in shipping, doubling Europeans' cargo capacity per person. Because labour was now so scarce, sailing ships replaced oared ships, except in Mediterranean warfare, which was a special case. And larger sailing ships with lower crew to cargo ratios were preferred to smaller ones. The average size of English ships went from 36 tons in 1359 to 65 tons in 1410 to 100 tons in 1450. And as these low tonnages indicate, England was not yet a major maritime power. Those powers who were major had ships several times this size. The Genoese, for example, had 40 ships of over 500 tons. Mediterranean and Atlantic shipbuilding methods, as is well known, hybridized, strengthening hulls and improving rigs and improving building methods. By 1409, some ships had added a third mast, which gave extra maneuverability. The full-rigged three-master emerged by about 1430. In sharp contrast to other sail-only ships worldwide, it was a generalist, able to cope with most seas and most seasons anywhere on the planet. By the 1460s, three masters able to carry heavy cannon appeared. Maritime historians are well aware of most of these changes. What is seldom acknowledged is the role of the Black Death in this late medieval technological revolution. The European expansion kit did not enable the transfer of large regular armies or the building of large overseas empires from scratch. What it did do was allow Europeans to scout the world's coasts, like eagles or like vultures, depending on your perspective, looking for opportunities such as ailing empires to hijack. Gun forts allowed Europeans to cling like leeches to the flanks of healthy land powers. Better guns, better gunships, and gun forts gave few men high firepower. This emerged less from any special European gift from Athena than from the fact that plague forced Europeans to learn to project power with small numbers. I always have a coughing fit when I give lectures like this. It seems de rigueur. The expansion kit also included softer forms of power, plague-adapted institutions, non-violent technologies, and subcultures which could be put to expansive use. I think that economic history's Douglas orthodoxy exaggerates the importance of institutions, but these did have a role. For one thing, they might have given plague-assisted birth to European-style capitalism, beginning in the northern Italian city-states, where the first emergence of permanent public debt, central banks, maritime insurance, and arguably the modern company can be traced to soon after the Black Death, sometimes very soon after. The Genoese Mahona was a large virtual family which adopted a common name, as though everyone working for Microsoft was surnamed Gates. Mahona flowered after the plague. One ran the island of Chios and its profitable mastic industry for 2 centuries after 1362. Mahona have long seemed plausible ancestors for the modern company, though so Neanderthal a forebear is not popular with economists who prefer rationalist and individualist lineages. There is an echo of Mahona in the semantic association of kin and company still with us today in the term company. Com panis, those with whom you share bread at a shared table or board. In 1997, a perceptive scholar, David Herlihy, connected printing to plague, arguing that Gutenberg's achievement in the 1450s, I quote, was only the culmination of many experiments carried on across the previous century, unquote. I agree with him, and those experiments can actually be documented. The print revolution was a Western European speciality, but an overlooked sister development went West Eurasia wide, a scribal revolution. In universities, monasteries, mosques, and madrasas, teachers and students halved around 1350, but rooms and endowments did not. Indeed, endowments increased as donors sought to appease an angry god. Wealthier parents with fewer surviving children had more money to spend on their education. Literacy increased, moderately but significantly, throughout West Eurasia. This was reinforced by a visual transition, which has had very little press. When you lose half your scribes, or your authors, or your artists, or your artisans, or your historians, for that matter, you try to squeeze more out of the survivors through longer working days and longer working lives. Whale oil imports for lamps and wax for candles surged in the later 14th century, as did production of window glass and eyeglasses. Eyeglasses countered the failing eyesight of people in their 40s or older, and amongst other things, buttressed burgeoning bureaucracies. Sorry about the alliteration there, it crept in. Both north and south. Eyeglasses too predated plague, but began mass production in southern European cities soon after it. A major market was Muslim. Barcelona's municipal records, I quote, mention the export of 2,160 pairs of eyeglasses to Alexandria in 1403. In 1482, some 1,100 pairs of Florentine glasses were sold to various Ottoman cities. In the single year of 1540, 24,000 pairs of glasses were exported from Venice to the Levant. Yet another element of European expansion was a social adaptation. A crew culture of disposable males. Wandering workers who were now surplus to the requirements of their home economy. After 1350, regions in which grain growing was marginal reduced it and began importing their grain from more fertile regions. They turned to other activities, pastoral farming or specialist crops, in which women and children's labour was at least as effective as men's. The surplus men hired themselves out in crews or teams to a transnational labour market, at first returning home for the grain harvest, which was the great labour bottleneck, but increasingly staying away for several years at a time as the scale of the harvest at home diminished. These men often served in someone else's army as mercenaries, mostly within Europe, and the Swiss case is the most famous in the period. 1.2 million soldiers left Switzerland between about 1350 and 1800, of whom only 400,000 returned. These crewmen also manned warships, whaling ships, codfishers, and worked as navvies, miners, long-range drovers, fur trappers, increasingly venturing outside Europe from the 1360s. Crew numbers grew with the beginning of population recovery around 1500. Crews were the cutting edge of European expansion, and their numbers approached those of the other big source of expansive labour, enslaved Africans. My best guess is that 8 million European crewmen ventured beyond Europe between 1350 and 1800, mainly between 1500 and 1800. Most of them died prematurely. We should not romanticize these crewmen. They were brutal, violent, and often poxed, if not plagued. They considered brawling with knives to be light entertainment. Would have enjoyed London today. They did not have to be army or navy to be well armed. A 17th century Basque whaling ship with a crew of 39 carried 14 cannon, 30 muskets, 24 pistols, 30 cutlasses, and 40 grenades. Sailors are the best known variety of crewmen by a mile, but all crewmen had a recognisably similar subculture with its own songs, folk tales, and customs. The latter included cursing, drinking, gambling, superstition, mutiny, misogyny, and rioting. A high tolerance of known risk, possibly plague-related, was another feature of early crewmen. Male absence meant that back home, crew regions were woman-led. Women ran businesses as well as households. These regions had consistently high illegitimacy, 4 or 5 times the normal rate, and an unusually high tolerance of wifely infidelity. Upon the return of the husband, writes one historian of a northern Portuguese crew region, the woman would hang out a pair of his pants on the clothesline to alert her lovers to stay away. You can tell crew regions from their cemeteries, which contain half the expected number of adult males. Two elements of the expansion kit favoured Western Europe: galleons and print. The first required an Atlantic coast. The second clashed with the cultural importance of translating the Quran in Islam. Yet it was the Ottoman Empire which led the way with the rest of the expansion kit. It was West Eurasia's first big modern state because it was the best plague manager. By utilising the scribal revolution, though not print, and by recruiting talent and labour by hook or by crook, it developed an exceptionally effective bureaucracy. Through the devshirme system, it enslaved promising Christian youths, then educated, converted, and in effect freed them, an Ottoman Rhodes Scholarship. It drew heavily on crew regions in addition to the devshirme, like the Greek islands and Albania, for voluntary manpower. It is now thought that the Ottomans attracted many voluntary Christian renegades because they paid better and their army, navy, and bureaucracy were more meritocratic. The Ottomans also deployed and honed two long-standing Muslim institutions. Sufis, radical holy men known as colonizing dervishes, because their lodges and influence could revive or take over a district, and waqf, an endowment with charitable, educational, and underestimated economic functions. The Ottoman elite founded numerous waqf to restore productivity in regions devastated by plague or war. Colonizing dervishes were supported by the state. This type of communal religious colonization may be the forgotten archetype of Russian monastic colonization in Siberia and Iberian missionary townships in Latin America. The Ottomans also enslaved on an Atlantic scale. A common colonizing dynamism risks common colonizing sins. And they were as quick to guns as they were to glasses. The new plague-incubated gun technology emerged in a stretch of Middle Europe from Belgium to northern Italy, which had the right ecological mix of timber, fast-running water to power bellows, and slow-running water to transport charcoal, which was shaken to dust if it was transported in carts over any distance. Like most of Europe, most Europeans, I should say, the Ottomans did not invent plague-improved guns, but they adopted and adapted them at least as fast as anyone. They were probably the first to pull triggers and fire volleys, and they certainly pioneered standing armies and artillery trains. They produced 3 times as much gunpowder as the Spanish Empire in the 1500s. They used their bureaucracy to modernize feudalism. Large armies of cavalry, serving in return for landholdings, were kept up to speed by small armies of scribes, some wearing glasses, checking Timariots off against the records at each muster. While gun galleons did not feature until the quite late in the 18th century, no, maybe the late 17th century, seagoing gun galleys and riverine gunboats certainly did. The Ottomans were pioneers in both those latter categories. The Ottomans made few conquests outside West Eurasia, but they did mount a great diversion. Russia might well have preferred Istanbul to Siberia, and Western Europeans would certainly have preferred Egypt and the Holy Land to the Americas, at least before the Americas were found to be full of gold and silver. The Ottomans did not give them the choice to expand southwards. It was the Ottomans that forced European expansion to go global and forced European expansion kits to raise their game. Other Muslim empires did go beyond West Eurasia. From the 17th century, the Omanis took over Portuguese port cities in East Africa and acquired something of a formal empire in India too. They did use European-style galleons. Morocco and Mughal expansionists did not, though riverine gunboats featured large in their conquests, still not well known. These Muslim empires, like the Russians, have been excluded from early modern colonial empires because they were overland, not overseas. Yet these expansions too relied on thin and fragile links, a sequence of island-like forts and oases between metropolis and empire, crossing tigers, deserts, and mountains rather than seas, and using many elements of the same plague-incubated expansion kit. The story of Moroccan conquest of gold-rich Songhai, the Songhai Empire, and sub-Saharan West Africa in the 1590s, in particular, reads very like that of the Spanish conquest of Mexico earlier in the same century. The Moroccans used a small army of musketeers transported across 1,000 miles of desert by caravans, not caravels. They too found local allies and were not above treachery towards folk considered inferior, just like the Spanish. Just like the Spanish, on Tenochtitlan's lake in central Mexico, they even built gunboats, in this case on the Niger River. Some of the parts carried on camelback. Russians and Mughals also made great use of riverine gunboats, gun forts, cannon, and musketeers. The Mughals used Ottoman techniques to manage their empire and their cavalry, who were even more numerous than their musketeers and artillerymen. They also used colonizing dervishes, notably in Bengal, which has been described as the Muslim America. The Mughal metropolis was wholly informal. It was Safavid Persia, from which the Mughals extracted regular flows of leaders, soldiers, experts, literati, and horses, whether the Shahs liked it or not. The Western European version of the plague-forged West Eurasian expansion kit was rendered more global by its galleons and better promoted by its printing. But we should be wary of exaggerating its grip on the rest of the world. Before 1800, it was seldom a matter of empire building, as I previously noted, except in Mexico, Peru, and Bengal, where existing empires were hijacked. It was more a matter of trading, slaving, and commercial hunting networks with patches of plantations and settlement, partial patchwork empires at best. But the plague-forged expansion kit did allow Europeans to cherry-pick and squeeze vulnerable and valuable regions, to select and acquire global best practice, and to reshuffle people, bullion, and biota around the planet in their own interest. China did quite well out of this too. It remained the world's richest and most populous empire. Populous empire, not populist, sorry. Its silks and porcelain had long been a magnet for the rest of the world's merchants. Muslims brought China spices, aromatics, and dyes in return for the silks and porcelains they sought. Russia brought it prime furs in vast quantities. Western Europeans brought it furs, sea otters, and fur seals from both ends of the Pacific, as well as a large share of Latin American bullion and the full range of American biota, which the Chinese put to very good use. With the Zhenghe exception, China let other peoples do the dirty work, globalizing by attraction, not expansion. Up until 1840, it was a silent partner, not a victim, of West Eurasian expansion. Moving towards a close now, this summary is brief to the point of caricature. But the broad argument is that plague-triggered factors, internal and external, combined with other variables to cause a West Eurasian set of economic developments and geographic expansions, whose prime beneficiaries narrowed over time. First, West Eurasia, then Western Europe, and finally, Britain, to which I devote my final page. Some of my colleagues will tell you this is relatively generous treatment of British history for me. Britain's ascent to global preeminence took place over the 18th century, and it may seem to be drawing a very long bow indeed to connect it to the Black Death of 1350. Yet most experts would agree that the four pillars of Britain's rise were maritime enterprise, the export of manufactured textiles, commercial farming, and the increasing dominance of London. All these four can be shown to have first flowered in the 70 years after 1350, and that can be documented. I don't have time to do it here, but I have got a 640-page book, which you can read if you choose. There were, of course, many ups and downs for Britain over the succeeding centuries, but in the 1700s, it became the chief heir of plague-triggered and plague-enabled Western European expansion. This was partly due to its institutions, some inherited from plagued North Italian city-states. The magic trick performed by London and Amsterdam before it was transubstantiating these capitalist city-state institutions into a nation-state. A talent for imperial takeovers was also important. England hijacked Mughal Bengal and mounted somewhat friendlier takeovers of the Portuguese and, to a lesser extent, the Dutch and Spanish empires. It lost the USA politically, but not economically. Anglo-American trade increased steadily after independence in 1783, and New England captains continued to helm the British whaling fleet. The continuing replacement of labour by capital, a plague precedent, in farming in the 18th century generated more and more English crewmen. Combined with a takeover of the North Sea transnational labour pool from the Dutch, who had taken it in turn from the Hanseatic League, this enabled Britain to become not just a crew region, but almost a crew country. It was the first state able to man both its merchant fleet and its navy in time of war, which gave it a crucial edge over its French and Spanish rivals. By the 1750s, not all sea lanes led to London, but most did. At the same time, key global inputs, fruits of the cherry picking, were concentrated and magnified by English variables until they kindled the mid-18th century hearths of industrialization. In Lancashire, emulating Indian cotton, and in Staffordshire, emulating Chinese porcelain. I myself think that plaguing and globalizing British history makes it more interesting, not less. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Jamie. So now, as you all know, you have a chance to put in questions that you might like to put to our speaker. I mean, Jamie, you've spoken on such a capacious range of topics. Maybe to give people a chance to think about what they want to ask about and put their questions down, I might start things off with a first question to you, and then I will monitor the Q&A and put questions that have come in from others. So one of the questions I was going to ask, and I'm selfishly asking as an early modernist, because one of the real striking things in what you're doing in this book is you're getting us to think about a period of time that is normally divided up into smaller pieces. And I take you back to what you said at the start about this idea of the plague era that lasts from 1350 to 1500. And global history has had quite a transformative impact on how we think about the Renaissance around the same time. And I wonder if you could start by saying a bit more to us about how you think this plague era was related or not to the period we tend to think about in the late 15th, early 16th century, the Renaissance and the sort of moments of creative genius that we tend to locate in Europe in this period. So how should plague help us think differently about the Renaissance?
Thanks, John Paul. I mean, that's a very difficult question, as you may know. The Renaissance has got an extremely complex scholarship, and entering it, as you know, it was a bit like well, in my case at least, a bull in a china shop. But I have thought about it, and I do think there are some plague implications for the Renaissance. One is, and other people have hit upon this, the sheer transnationalism of it. The last 10 or 15 years of Renaissance historiography have emphasized that. You've got a Timurid Renaissance in what you might call Greater Iran, Greater Persia, which occurs at the same time. And you've got various other developments in Islamic science and literature, which ricochet with developments in Western Europe, as do developments in Eastern Europe. I mean, Poland is a very interesting player in the Renaissance, which is underestimated, let alone the Dutch Renaissance and the English Renaissance. So it's much less Italian and much less Western European than it would seem at first glance. And there are also some kind of what you might call more mundane or logistic impacts. If you suddenly lose half your artists, it breaks up pre-existing systems where craft and art families tended to recruit from within their own kin. And you start to see a diminution of potential talent at one level, because it's just people have just been halved, but an increase is at another as the sort of talent quest is taken more broadly. Another factor is, and this is well known, suddenly patrons have a hell of a lot more money, and they're able to invest this in developing arts and literature. So I think there is, I think, plaguing the historiography of the Renaissance and the Reformation, for that matter, is a task that's still to be done.
Okay, great. Thank you. We'll come back to the Reformation if we have time, because I think that people will be hearing in your comments at the beginning about a way of thinking about the Catholic, Orthodox, and Muslim world in a connected way, which I think many will find very interesting. So I'm looking at our Q&A, and I note too that there are ways of upvoting questions, that if you find that you don't have a question of your own but would like to prioritize certain questions over other, they're coming in. And what I'll do is I'll just, I think, put a question to you, Jamie, and then we'll just go from there. So I've got a question from Chris Hooley, and who's asking about the mechanisms by which the death of half of the population led to an increase in income for the rest. He wants to know, was it mainly upward pressure on labor prices because of labor shortages? And if so, do you have anything to say about organized labor? I mean, were they involved, or are there other factors at play in this?
Yes, in the sense there was, organized labor. This is a period of numerous urban proletarian and rural peasant rebellions. The number's quite extraordinary. Suddenly the number of these tripled after the Black Death. The reason was sometimes said to be, the most famous English example is 1381, the Peasants' Revolt. Sometimes these rebellions were said to be caused by desperation and dire poverty, but other scholars have demonstrated that they look much more like attempts to retain plague gains from elites eager to claw them back. Elites being, church, monarchs, lords, and so on. So you could call that organized labor in a very upfront sense. But essentially the halving of labor basically dramatically increased real wages. There was some inflation, but the rate of the rate of wage increase well outpaced it. In addition, most people weren't wage workers; they were peasants, and there was a similar labor shortage on manors, which essentially forced lords to cut better deals with their peasants to keep them. If they didn't, their peasants scarpered, and other lords would shelter and aid and abet them, desperate to have their fields ploughed and their pastures worked. So there were a whole series of mechanisms by which agricultural production per person was increased at the same time as it diminished per acre and per seed, through a whole range of mechanisms which I describe. I think it's in chapter 3 of the book. But essentially, I don't think you'd find many economic historians disagreeing these days that although a golden age might be a bit of an exaggeration, there's a very strong uplift in the living conditions of the mass of the people right across Europe, including Eastern Europe and Anatolia and parts of North Africa, such as Tunisia, in the 150 years after the Black Death. This it can't be documented in a way that would satisfy econometric historians who, want long sequences of comparable statistics. But the cumulative evidence from particular localities is very strong. And then, of course, after 1500, when population started to rise again, labor lost its leverage and conditions started to diminish.
Do we know anything, Jamie, about how were places that had urban centers more likely to feel these impacts? I'm thinking of what you're saying about peasants being paid, better wages and being able to negotiate themselves better than was the case before. Do we think that they are being drawn into cities as a result of these?
Well, we know they were being drawn into cities because cities, although the initial plague impact was equal in both city and country, very rare for diseases which usually focus on urban environments. For the first 100 years or so, at least, it was roughly equal between city and country. Thereafter, it started to focus on cities for a whole complex set of rat studies reasons, which we might not go into. But essentially, cities' populations were partly restored by immigration from the countryside. And this was quite routine. And labor mobility included not just going to other manors where they could get the best conditions, the best tenures, not necessarily the best wages, but say, as instead of giving half your share crop to the landlord, you give a third of it, something like that. They also went to cities. And so cities were less severely depopulated, and the urban proportion of the population, which is often used as a proxy for prosperity, increased.
So maybe, Jamie, we could turn to a question that picks up exactly on that point about cities. I've got a question here from Helen Carr, who's interested in knowing a bit more about how these differences played out for different groups. So in particular, Helen refers to work carried out by Judith Bennett, who's done work on a post-plague era being a new age for women, in particular in these urban zones, in relation to types of work, management of the home, agency, wealth. Would you agree with this? And would you say that this was the case across this newly constructed Western Eurasia?
To some extent it was, but it was a kind of, I would say it was an aborted revolution. There was an initial major increase in women's wages, including women's relative wages. A husband and wife peasant team would gain equally in the improvement in tenures, at least in theory, assuming that it was evenly distributed between them. And there is a lot of evidence of growing women's initiative in several industries, including one that Judith Bennett talks about, which is brewing, ale brewing. And there's also evidence of women's leadership in other fields. But what tends to happen is that it's over time reined back in by males trying to, what's the term, rein in or haul in women's gains. And that seems to be a bit of a pattern in gender history. A great crisis like a great migration or a great disaster gives women a chance to improve their fate, and they take it, which at least shows that male hegemony is not immutable. But after a while, the patriarchy, by hook or by crook, weasels its way back into holding the whip hand.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'll turn now to a set of questions that are in a way about origins and genealogy of Black Death itself. So one of the questions we have from Kieran Burns takes up the idea that previous generations of historians have had that the Black Death originated in China. And could you say a bit more about what is the new evidence that it didn't?
Well, yes, I can. The latest evidence, which is mainly genomic, says that both the Justinian pandemic, which was in about the 6th century AD CE, and the Black Death pandemic came from the Tian Shan Mountains in Kyrgyzstan, where the plague strands have been found that are very closely related to those found in corpses related to the Black Death. Now that is, although it's still quite distant from where the plague first appears in Europe, which is now known to be in Lashchevo in the Middle Volga, not the Black Sea. It's in the Middle Volga, quite close to the city of Kazan. And then it comes down the Volga and the Russian river system to the Black Sea and the Caspian before going Mediterranean wide. But that strand can be, there's an explanation for the movement of that, from Kyrgyzstan to Eastern Europe, the Middle Volga, that works much better than for the expansion to China. China eventually did get the Black Death, but not, I think, until the 17th century. And furthermore, you know, the evidence of depopulation in China, depopulation was grim, but that was mainly due to the Mongol invasions and the Yuan Ming transition and various other diseases and wars and famines and extractions of slaves and prisoners of war. It was so high that it can't accommodate a Black Death type phenomenon as well. So, and there's also very little actual Chinese evidence of 14th century plague, whereas there's good evidence of 17th century plague, and they were just as literate in the 14th century as they were in the 17th.
So we've got quite a few people interested in rats now, so I'm going to ask you a few questions about rat-borne plague. I mean, taking up this point about evidence and contemporary accounts that existed at the time of all of this. So Martin Fisher asks that on the matter of rat-borne plague, there don't seem to be many reports, or are there, of mass rat deaths. And is that a problem to the received wisdom of a sort of bubonic plague transmission?
Yes, it's true that there are very few, not quite as few as we once thought, but still very few. And I suspect the explanation is that the rats we're talking about are black rats, not today's brown rat. So they're half the size, they're very nocturnal, and they're very commensal. They live inside people's houses, in their roofs, in the roofs of their barns. They're known as the roof rat or the house rat. So they're much smaller, more timid, and more nocturnal and less commensal than the rats we know today. So, you know, during the third pandemic in India, you did have some evidence of rats dropping from the roof when they died of plague. That was only in about 1/5 of cases. Now, in a European context, you see dead rats, you're not going to assume that's anything, you know, that normal when noticed and normal when not noticed, sort of thing, and seeing, you know, how long are they going to survive the waste disposal system of medieval towns, which consists of hungry pigs and dogs and cats and carrion fowl, and are they going to seem abnormal at all? It's just another rat, a dead rat. So,
so why? I'm sorry. So, well, one of the other questions related to that, Jamie, comes from Nick Wilcox. I mean, so why did these outbreaks keep recurring? Is this something happening in terms of the genetics of the bacteria themselves? I mean, what explains over this long period of time that you've laid out why these outbreaks keep occurring in the way that they did?
That's a very good question, quite a tricky one. One possibility is that there's just recycling between the first wave of plague and the second. The first wave finishes in northern Russia in 1353. The second wave starts not that far away in 1359. So, the first and second waves could have just been a recircling, but that doesn't work for later plagues. And what I think is happening is that there is a capacity for medium-range transmission by camel caravans. I won't go into the details of it, but it's pretty convincing. And in certain areas where camels are used, they transfer not only plague to humans and to commensal rats, but also to new species of wild rodents. So plague foci of wild rodents emerge in the Volga region, in possibly parts of the Balkans, which is then Ottoman and camel using, parts of Kurdistan, to which the same applies, and parts of North Africa. So these foci are a hell of a lot closer than the Tian Shan Mountains, and new plagues generate from them. And you can notice this in some of the work that Belich, Belich has done on the Ottoman Empire, that until about 1520, plague seems to come from other regions to Constantinople. And after that, it seems to go from Constantinople to other regions. So there's a kind of shift in which the Muslim South is dealt an unlucky card in that it's capable of hosting new wild rodent foci, plague reservoirs, as they're also called.
Do we know on this point about how different societies responded in different ways to the plague itself? Anthony Kinghorn asks a question about this, whether there were epidemiological factors or other factors, maybe cultural or religious, that explain, for example, how Europeans or Ottomans or Chinese empires responded to the plague.
There is a literature on that.
What do you think of it?
Well, there are a number of subjects I've had to avoid to read the couple of thousand sources I needed to actually get to what I've got to. But there is a literature that says that in Islam, the abode of Islam, you don't run from plague, you accept it as the will of Allah and focus your attention on nursing the sick and helping refugees. There is some evidence for that, but not vast. One common quality you do tend to get across the religious divides is that elites run like hell when the plague appears, and they have the capacity to run further and faster. So there's some evidence of them having slightly lower mortality rates, but nature takes its revenge on them by ensuring that if you go to a region that escapes the plague in the first strike, in one strike, it's almost definitely not going to escape the plague in the next strike, because it will be saturated with live, uninfected rats when the new infected rat arrives. Whereas regions that it's been hit, the rats will have been killed off. So that's a well-documented characteristic of plague. If it misses region A, if one strike misses region A, second strike will hit it.
What's it your sense, Jamie, looking at these different societies, that they accumulated knowledge? In other words, that they developed better ideas of how to react to the plague over time? Or does all this accumulated wisdom just end up, falling into a black hole somewhere?
No, well, I mean, the classic example there is the emergence of quarantine, which they tried 30 days quarantines and then tried 40 days quarantines, Caron, from which the term quarantine comes. We're talking about Dubrovnik and Marseille, and I think one or two Italian cities are the key ones here. And a 40-day blockage does work to some extent, but never perfectly, because they didn't know that they were trying to block the access not just of humans and their obvious baggage, but also of rats and their fleas. So, but plague would die out in in an isolated context like a ship in about 40 days, because by that time, all the rats and all the fleas, all the rats and all the people all the rats would die. Those people who are going to be infected would die, and all the plague-infected fleas would die. About 40 days is the cutoff. It can't go further than that, which is why, another reason why it getting to India and China is less likely than it seems. It's got a 40-day oceanic limit until the end of the 19th century, when you start getting big steamships which carry grain cargoes. And it's then that you see the third pandemic go global from the 1890s.
Okay, one further question on some of these nitty-gritty points about the plague itself, and then we'll move to some larger questions about causation and some of the other arguments that you made. So Anthony Coombs asks whether the risk of plague recurring was increased by the practice of excavating bodies of plague victims, and whether more generally, I mean, in terms of the treatment of the dead, do you see much of a divergence between how different societies treat the dead in light of the plague?
Yes, I mean, there are some sad stories about infected individuals being quarantined, and they had food thrown to them from ships and if they missed it, that was tough. Things like that. They were kind of the new lepers, as it were. But human to human transmission was not that easy. If a person died of plague, their fleas would leave them as soon as possible and would probably die as well. So I doubt that. I mean, you've seen illustrations, no doubt, of those long snouts on plague doctors' masks. So that was intended to keep a distance. And certainly there was some human to human transition via fleas, or perhaps even via spittle. But it wasn't really long range, and it wasn't really capable of causing a second strike.
Okay. All right. So we've got quite a few questions now about the argument about the driver of change. I mean, this is a bold book that makes what I think is a provocative and a stunning argument about motors of change in the past and why things happen or don't happen in some places. So let me turn, Jamie, to a few questions in that regard. So the first comes from Paul Lee, who writes that it's often said that the plague reduced unfairness through better pay of the smaller number of workers that remained. We talked about that a bit. In this case, that seems to be the main driver of the greater scope for consumption that you identified at the start of your talk. So should we, or could we, consider increased fairness as the spark for all the advances that you're talking about?
Well, I don't know. There's a sort of Thomas Piketty question here, isn't there? It's certain that the early plague era was one of the very rare periods when inequality diminished. But that was mainly because the poor got somewhat richer rather than the rich getting poorer. The rich got richer too. So after 1500, you see a reintroduction of inequality. But before it, you do have this golden age, which institutes some interesting cultural developments. For example, the notion of migrating to improve your lot is at first regional. Things like Castilians going to Andalusia and northern Portuguese going south or to the Atlantic islands. These are later major sources of migrants to the Americas. But you also have a kind of arguably the formation of a peasant consciousness, a notion that it is not necessarily inevitable that we be the scum of the earth all the time. And that kind of notion that peasants survive by being fatalistic becomes contestable in this context. This is when, as I said before, you see numerous peasant rebellions, which continue in Eastern Europe right up to, say, 1525, well, in Germany as well. 1525, big peasant rebellion in Germany, the similar ones in Hungary, You also have the Chalali rebellions, which might not, in the Ottoman Empire, which might not be unrelated. And you have a certain, a sense that the common man is contesting with elites, the common person is contesting with elites for dominance. In the end, they fail. And the 16th century sees a reassertion of elite hegemony. But arguably a certain legacy is left, a peasant awareness of a world we have lost, when there were still masters, but masters and men were treated more equally, and where common folk could eat meat, could hunt, and could have some kind of quality of life. That was no longer the case. There was a folk memory of it, if you like, which I would suggest dates back to the early plague era.
Yeah, there's a really quite remarkable transformations across the whole range of everyday lived experience that you're talking about. One of the questions that comes in from Jonathan Mandelbaum asks whether contemporaries in the 14th to the 17th century, sort of observers of the plague era and the way you've described it, do they analyze it, its economic or social or military impact, in terms similar to yours that foreshadow the argument you're making? In other words, do you have contemporaries talking about this in this way?
To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. The people often observe that the first strike, the Black Death itself, is grossly underrepresented in contemporary archives. Basically, people didn't write about it much. Everybody knew about it. Why write about it, sort of thing. It does appear in certain things like manorial records of tenants and ordinations of priests and so on. So there's not that much, but you do get a lot of observations from the elite saying, oh, the times are terrible. Peasants are now starting to wear silver-lined belts. You can't tell who is who, because people are, these peasant girls are wearing genteel outfits. This is just disgusting. And you get a huge upsurge in sumptuary laws, whereby elites are trying to control lower class consumption by order, by saying, there's a classic Venetian great council saying all new fashions are banned, which is in the early 16th century. But so through that kind of thing, you can track these effects. How is it that the peasants have got so much money to spend on this stuff now? And you get people saying, oh, who wants pepper now? The peasants have it all the time. You get kind of evidence from the middens of aristocratic tables that says up until a certain point, ducks and geese and capons are enough to demonstrate the superiority of the high table to the low. But after around 1350, even the lower middle class starts having these things. So lords have to turn to swans and herons and, whatever to maintain their distance. And there's a number of other kind of examples one could quote of that. So, there is literary as well as other types of evidence of plague effects, and it's quite substantial.
Well, I guess what you're saying then also is that sometimes historians focus so closely on those contemporary voices, on those individual moments, those individual reports, that we forget that if you back away a bit, you might find that these individuals are stuck in cages they may not even realize they're in.
That's true. That's true, but I'm not sure it's the whole explanation for what seems a quite extraordinary plague evasion. I mean, here's a context in which half the people you're talking about have died. Yet social historians and cultural historians tend mostly to give the plague a kind of terrible vignette. There was the dire plague, and then bowl on as though it never happened. Now, why is that? I'm just not sure. Is it that it's just too big to comprehend, that there is not enough contemporary analysis of it, that humans are supposed to make their own history, not external events, not curveballs from nature like the Black Death? or that historians don't like to have their cherished causal linkages cut by some simplistic Gordian knot like the plague. So, I mean, to be honest, it's still a bit of a mystery to me that plague effects, which you would assume would be pretty pervasive. You know, so much of this, of European history, I feel, is written rather like a, dare I say it, an urban history of Hiroshima in the 20th century that hardly mentions the bomb.
Okay, thank you. We've got quite a few more questions, James. So I'm gonna ask you to reflect on the question from Robin Bainham. And Robin writes that all the advances you've described required significant invention in lots of different fields. And you've argued effectively that the rate of invention increased hugely after the plague. How far, Robin asks, was this acceleration of invention due specifically to the plague? Again, another question about drivers of change here.
Well, interestingly enough, there's not a lot of invention. Instead, what you have is the uptake of pre-existing technologies, windmills, water mills, eyeglasses, guns, all exist before the plague. What happens is their mass uptake occurs after the plague. They suddenly become vitally necessary because you've lost so much labor. And you have the capital to not quite mass produce them, but to produce them in substantial quantities. And you have the metals to do so. And you have the charcoal to do so and whatever. So that's why I'm a little reluctant to kind of cite, to talk about a plague industrial revolution. Although I think cumulatively it does come pretty close. It's the mass uptake, not the invention, that seems to be key here. So in shipping, for example, you get the development of pre-existing caravels developing a third mast, and then that's transferred to cogs and carracks, which then have three masts. And so it tends to be squeezing the lemon a lot more of existing technologies than was previously the case. And of course, eventually a quantitative change becomes a qualitative change. And you have armies where you don't just have a couple of huge cannon for siege guns, but almost everybody has a gun or a pike to protect the gunners.
Did this sort of expansion, so we had a somewhat related question from Roger Harrison about family-based workshops. You mentioned revolutions in industry. As with other artists, did other trades expand apprenticeships to replace the system of family-based workshops? And Roger gives the example of cities needing bricks, and bricks needed a revolution in brick making that we still see visible in today's old buildings.
Yeah, I think that particularly Dutch bricks and German bricks were one of the post-plague technologies, or plague-improved technologies. So yes, the social history of apprenticeships is fascinating, and I've read quite a lot about it in terms of 15th and 16th centuries, but the records aren't so good for the 14th and 15th. What you do get is a clear impression that apprentices are now drawn not from your family or your colleague's family. You know, there tends to be a swap between, you know, so for example, swordsmiths families in Piacenza would swap apprenticeships amongst a few families. Now there's a lot more outreach. Now there's a lot more adoption. The talent may be halved, but the talent quest has more than doubled its scope. And you do see also, you know, the general availability of more iron and steel for tools, and you see some amazing things happening, in particular in silk spinning mills, water-powered in Bologna on quite a large scale, where small workshops actually have their own water-powered spinning mechanisms. There's an interesting Italian scholarship on this, which I've read in translation. And that's not the only case in point. So it does go down the, you know, craftsmen do relatively well, but because wage labor is now in such demand, the the difference between what, say, a carpenter gets and what a manual laborer gets diminishes.
So you've taken us in your chronology as late as the British today, but we have quite a few questions of others who may want you to push this chronology even further. So maybe I could ask you, Jamie, to reflect a bit on the relationship between the plague and politics and political development. So one of our questions comes from Alban Schmidt, who writes that the plague is sometimes considered a reason for serfdom in Central and Eastern Europe. Do you think it contributed to more authoritarian governmental traditions in these regions?
Possibly ultimately, but that serfdom thing is a bit of a that notion is being shot down these days by people like Sermon. Is that how you? It's Cerman, where you find that it's not actually serfdom's not actually imposed after the Black Death. It's imposed after the population starts to recover. And so you find most of these the laws reducing peasants to serfdom actually date from the late 15th century and even more from the 16th century, not only in Russia, but also in Poland. So the initial effect on peasants in Eastern Europe, I think, was much more similar to that in Western Europe than has generally been believed. But in Eastern Europe, after the recovery from the Black Death begins, around about 1500, the downturn is measured more in the control of labor, which is even that's a bit deceptive because the Russian state, for example, and the Polish state to some extent, they're paying a double game. They're trying to keep serfs in place, but also encouraging them to run away to the Cossacks and to the new lands of the south so that they can settle those and control those. So I think that the downturn in the living conditions of Eastern European peasants occurs in 1500, and an upturn occurs in 1350, because these people's labor is now more valued, and because the mead and wax that Russian peasants produce almost industrially is from semi-farming beehives and trees is now worth much more, and the demand for it is much greater, as is also the case with furs, which they also take. So if you start to see Russian and to some extent Polish peasants as more as farmer foresters than as like the sort of North American equivalents in the 18th century, 17th century, they actually get more opportunities and do reasonably well relatively, with a heavy emphasis on the relative, in the 15th century. And it's in the 16th and 17th that conditions start to deteriorate.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but this is how distorting serfdom is in this respect in this study. It's quite interesting. I mean, in a similar vein, there was a question from Kieran Burns about the Ottomans. And Kieran writes that you said that the Ottomans were the best at coping with the plague and that they had some of the best post-plague expansion tools. So why didn't they become imperialist in the way that the Europeans did? Was it the absence of demand, i.e. they didn't need to find new routes to spices, or the presence of nearby competitors like the Safavids?
Well, you're probably just as well able to answer that question as I am, John Paul. But I mean, my take on it would be, first, they had enough on their plates. I mean, the Ottoman Empire controlled an enormous stretch. I mean, if you take into account the Crimean Khanate, which was closely allied to them, they had a huge chunk of Europe and controlled the Middle East except for Persia, and controlled Mamluk Egypt and most of North Africa. They had enough on their plates, thank you. Second, they did actually conquer a few regions in sub-Saharan Africa. I can't remember the details too well, but they did do some of the stuff, and they had substantial informal relations with Southeast Asian Muslim states and Muslim states on the Western Indian coast. And they did send soldiers and cannon to them to help combat the Portuguese. But ultimately, their problem when they were trying to do that was a sort of ecological accident, which was that it was almost impossible. Well, it was impossible to find shipbuilding timber on the southern Arabian and Persian Gulf coasts. The way in which those regions went maritime was to import teak from India. Now, if you had the Portuguese blocking you out from Indian teak, the only way to get timber to the Mediterranean was the long way, and it was even longer than for the Portuguese. They tried doing it overland, and they did defeat the Portuguese in one or two naval encounters in the Red Sea, but they made a substantial effort, but couldn't quite get over this problem, the sort of catch-22. To be an Indian Ocean maritime power, you have to have shipbuilding timber. To get shipbuilding timber, you have to get to India. To get to India from Yemen or the Persian Gulf or Aden or Mecca, Jeddah, you have to have shipbuilding timber. So it was an ecological accident. But they did, they greatly influenced Russian expansion and challenged the Russians at various places at various times. And they greatly influenced Spanish and Portuguese military technology. And of course, Ottoman influenced people actually gave the English some training in early warfare, not only at Tangier, but also in piratical encounters between English shipping and the Barbary pirates. I mean, the Barbary pirates repeatedly landed in England and Ireland and took thousands of people prisoner. So, if you didn't match the Turks on land or sea, you're in trouble.
Yeah, that lasts for a long time, doesn't it?
Mm.
So I'm conscious of the time, Jamie. Maybe I could ask you one last question. I think all the questions have come in from the audience, but maybe I could just ask you to reflect a bit for us, having written this lovely big book, and you've given us such a range of evidence here. I mean, different types of evidence as well as different periods. And I imagine that in writing this book, that you've had to engage with a lot of the sort of scientific data and some of the works that are coming out of very different fields to what you might have dealt with for the work on settler colonialism. Can you say a bit, just reflect for us a bit about what it's like working with that sort of evidence and data coming from the scientific side? How did you work your way into that, being that sort of historian for this book?
Well, it's a risky game, and probably better done towards the end of your career than towards the beginning. And because you are trespassing in a lot of patches. But sometimes the specialists realize that you're actually trying that in a sense you're in the same game as them, because you're trying to add breadth to their depth, and that you're taking them seriously and trying to reinterpret their evidence rather than simply, ride right over it, or write wholly from a bird's eye view. So, and I've also been fortunate here at Oxford to be able to run through the Global History Centre a few seminars and workshops where I could actually engage with some of the scientists, some of the plague scientists, and some experts in other areas. But in the end, you do your reading, and you develop, I guess, kind of tertiary skills in looking for potential weaknesses in specialist literatures. And the great thing about both historians and scientists is they never agree. And from their disagreements, you can kind of triangulate views and generate a semi-independent view. And if you also, if you know what happened in Egypt, it doesn't necessarily tell you what happened in Morocco, but it's not a bad start. So you try to use the advantages of breadth and intersection and interaction rather than of depth and specialism. And you assume that the experts should take responsibility of conveying their information in comprehensible language, and that this is a responsibility even of scientists. And so you try to engage with that as best you can. Now, there's always a risk that you get something horribly wrong. And I thought I had done, actually, when I made my bid. I said the Tian Shan Mountains is where it came from, but fortunately, the science they did soon after the book came out agreed with me. So,
well, I think that's a very important note to end on. I mean, this sounds to me like the natural development of a field in history that has worked its way from texts to objects to all sorts of different kind of evidence and data. And I think about your book, but also I'm looking across the room at Geoffrey Parker's book on the 17th century general crisis and the role that climate change played in all of that. I mean, who's to say that we stand on more certain ground when we're standing on texts? So I think
absolutely, the text fetish, we've got to get beyond it. Material culture and science now matters a lot to historians too. Text remains important, but it's no longer enough.
well, with that, some of us will keep our dictionaries nearby, but we'll also start looking at bar graphs and charts and series of numbers. But
Yeah.
on that good note, I've been told to end promptly, so I should see that we've come to the end of our time, Jamie. And just let me thank you on behalf of all of our audience. We had a really great set of questions, and I think that's just a testament to how much you've put on the table and how engaging a set of topics and provocative ideas you've given us all to think about. Those who want to continue doing so, I do encourage you to have a look at the book, which will keep you busy thinking about lots of these ideas. But in the meantime, on behalf of everyone, thank you very much, James Belich, for speaking to us today about your new book. And we are encouraging all of you to come back to the next online Balliol seminar, details of which aren't confirmed yet, but you will hear about, no doubt, as is always the case. So thanks very much, Jamie.
Thank you.